Good morning and welcome everyone to the forum this morning. We welcome back our David Tremaine, who used to be on our staff. I'm so excited he's here today because he's one of my favorite people. So he is going to share with us today his learnings and reflections on the spirituality of addiction and recovery, and a book that he's written on that subject. And with that, I'm going to open us with a prayer, and I'm going to use prayer in the spirit of channeling David Tremaine. It's prayer number 56. So that's how he used to start the forums. Prayer number 56 on page 831. O blessed Lord, you ministered to all who came to you. Look with compassion upon all who, through addiction, have lost their health and freedom. Restore to them the assurance of your unfailing mercy. Remove from them the fears that beset them. Strengthen them in the work of their recovery. And to those who care for them, give patient understanding and persevering love. Amen. And with that, we'll turn it over to David. And as we do that, I'll invite you again to go on to mute until and unless David invites you to share a question or something like that.
Thank you, Jeff. Wow, so exciting to be here. I wish we were all in the Great Hall together. It would be way more fun. It is great to be here and not be in charge of any technology. That's maybe the most exciting thing about it. So I am going to talk about this book right here, The Beautiful Letdown, An Addict's Theology of Addiction. You can buy it on Amazon for $15, or you can ask me for a copy. I've got a bunch of them. It's interesting to talk to you all about this book as I've been preparing for this forum this week. The book came out exactly 1 year ago this week. And it feels like I wrote it in a different world. So it has been interesting to channel the ideas of the book again and try to get back in that mindset. And we'll see how it goes. So I want to begin. This is my general idea for how we'll go. I guess I should say you all know who I am, most of you. My name is David Tremaine. I'm now the minister of formation at Good Samaritan Episcopal Church in San Diego, California. I have been there for 1 year. And I'm the author of this book, The Beautiful Letdown, An Addict's Theology of Addiction. I have a Master's of Divinity from the Episcopal Theological Seminary of Virginia Theological Seminary. And I am hoping to not talk too much and leave a good amount of time for questions and thoughts. So I want to begin with a kind of guided meditation that I hope will lead us into some of the themes of the book and the ideas and the feeling of the book itself. And then give some time for reflection on that experience, if you would like. And then I'll talk about kind of the broad strokes of the book, the general themes, how it came to be, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I invite you all to maybe stretch your arms up and out, get a sense of feeling your body wherever you are. I don't think Jeff's really in the cathedral. I think that's a lie. I can tell because his arms are disappearing. All right, so when you're feeling yourself, feeling your body, maybe feel yourself sitting in your chair, feel your feet on the ground. get ready. And what we're gonna do is, if you would, whatever you're gonna feel most comfortable doing while I lead this guided meditation, whether that's having your camera on or off, having your eyes open or closed, the most important thing is to be able to focus both on the words I'm going to say, but also on your breath, on the experience of your body as it's happening, and just feeling yourself, feeling your embodiment, feeling your presence in this place right now, wherever you are. So I invite you to do whatever is going to make you feel most comfortable. And if you'd like to close your eyes, I invite you to do that now. If you want to turn off your camera, I invite you to do that now. And we're going to take one deep breath together, and then we'll begin. So on 3, we'll take a deep breath and then let it out. 1, 2, 3. Deep breath in and out. And now if you'd like to close your eyes or turn your gaze down. I invite you to imagine a place that feels extremely safe, especially in the midst of the worries and frustrations and anxieties and uncertainties of this moment. Where would you go? What would the place look like? It could be a real place. It could be a made-up place. This place where you could sit and feel a deep sense of safety, of peace, of well-being, of groundedness. What does this place look like? What does it smell like, if anything? Does it have a certain feel to it? Is it warmer or cooler on your skin? Do you need to wear a jacket there? Or is it comfortable without one? Get a sense of this place where you are now sitting. And as you feel your safety and your security and your wellness in this place, and you keep breathing, you're feeling your body there, I want you to see if you can think of a time as recently as possible that you did something, you performed some sort of action that in the moment you didn't want to do, or in retrospect you wish you hadn't done. Something that caused an immediate feeling of maybe shame or guilt, pain or suffering. Something that you may regret, especially if it's something that no one else knows that you did. Now, as you think back to this event, whatever it is, as you sit in this place, can you imagine what, excuse me one second. Imagine there's a small 2-year-old in your space with you. Just kidding. As we sit in this place and we remember this moment, can you think of the feelings that you had as you were leading up to this action? The emotions, the thoughts. What was taking place for you in this time? Can you remember where you were? What you were feeling? where you had just come from, what the thoughts were that were going through your head. If someone was with you, who that was, what they had done. If you were alone, where did these feelings come from that you were having? And as you hold this event gently, without judging its outcomes, without judging the action itself, without judging any of the thoughts or emotions surrounding it, can you imagine that this action is tethered to some part of you deep inside? That it is arising from somewhere deep down. And that this place, this part of yourself, can you imagine this part of yourself that it is tethered to? Can you imagine this part of yourself from which this action came? And as you imagine this part of yourself, can you get a sense of what this part of yourself feels like? Does it have some sort of form? A color maybe? Is there something distinct about the part of yourself from which this action emerged? Does it embody some kind of energy for you? And as you imagine this part of yourself, can you invite it into this safe place where you are? And invite it to sit down. Maybe if you're in a chair, there's another chair there now. Can you invite it to dwell with you in this space? And as it dwells with you, imagine you open up a dialogue with this part of yourself. And you begin to ask some questions. And you ask some simple questions of this part of yourself. Maybe, how old are you? You ask this part of yourself, what is it that you most deeply desire? You ask this part of yourself, what is it that you desire for me? And maybe you ask, what are you here to teach me? And as you sit in dialogue, maybe some of these answers emerge, and maybe they don't. There's no need to force them. What other questions arise for this part of yourself? And maybe linger in this space for a while. Answers, questions, silence. What does it feel like to sit with this part of yourself? Do you feel unsettled? Do you feel excited? Do you feel nervous, frustrated? What is coming up in you as you sit with this part? And imagine now that this part of yourself arises from wherever it's been settled in this place. And it begins to walk away, and it beckons you to follow you back to where it came from this deep place within you. What arises for you in this beckoning? What feelings and emotions emerge as it invites you deeper and deeper? Can you imagine what wisdom might be in this place where it is inviting you? Can you feel a wisdom emerging simply from asking these questions, from holding this space with this part of yourself? And as you hold this feeling, this wondering, this in-betweenness of asking questions and receiving answers, can you feel your body here, where you physically are, wherever you are on the other end of this camera? Can you hold this as you take in a deep breath and breathe into that place? Can you hold on to this curiosity, this wonder, this mystery and wisdom as you slowly look back up, open your eyes, breathing in and out? Maybe you turn your camera back on or not. It's up to you. As we come back together, can you feel in your body where this wisdom resides, where this curiosity exists in you? And I wonder, as we return, if anyone would be interested in sharing anything of what that experience, that imagining was like, what that sense of wonder feels like. If you have any kind of reflections or thoughts about that experience, maybe the part of yourself, maybe you didn't like it at all, maybe you couldn't see anything. Does anybody have any, would like to express any of these wonderings with the group? If not, it's okay, but I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to hear from one another since we're not in the same room.
I had a few reflections. I happened to be listening to Fareed Zakara this morning, and there was a speaker on how China had gone from being a kitten to a tiger in the room, and we had to deal with the tiger. We couldn't just wish it out of the room. And it sort of triggered when you said the 2-year-old. And my safe place was my porch, and there's some ugly stuff going on at work. And, my initial reaction was, let's just get rid of it. It's a fly in the ointment, get rid of it. But then it occurred to me in this process that it was like, I remember hearing that our aim should be to become like weathered wood. You incorporate all of the, adversities in life, and then you become beautiful by becoming like weathered wood. And so that's sort of how I ended up, is taking this ugly incident, and I can't get rid of it, but to make it more like weathered wood. And it seemed to me that's what also Fareed Zakara was saying with China. We have to work with them. We can't throw them out. So that was sort of my reflection.
Thank you, Barbara. It was wonderful. I love the silences on Zoom. They're so unique, I think. Does anybody else have any thoughts, reflections to share? Debbie?
Yeah. So mine started out as a place of I just don't have any more energy to do this one more thing at this particular time. And I ended up with the simple, I can do all things with God's help. And there's an unlimited amount of energy. There's an unlimited amount of whatever it is that I need to go through and do what is being presented to me during the day and during my life. And I need to remember that, to trust it and to allow it to flow through me.
Mm.
So thank you. I enjoyed this.
Thank you. I'm just writing these down as you're saying them, so I remember them. Thank you, Debbie. That was wonderful. Any other thoughts or reflections before I kind of get into the book more specifically?
David, I
Yes.
think that for me, I would have had a completely different thought process if we hadn't been in lockdown since March. I think that my life is so much more isolated because so much of the interaction I have with others is through Zoom and email and text. But I think that I felt similar things that Debbie did, that sometimes I'm overwhelmed with what I really need to do, and I have to step back because what I'm doing doesn't have to be done in a day. But what I've learned is my relationships with others, some I really didn't know before March, and some I knew barely. I have really made some wonderful relationships, and it's because I have more time to think, and I do not act quickly or write quickly. So maybe I don't have so many things that bother me with my relationships. Now, I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Someone had a chat comment. Hold on, I'm pulling it up. Oh, Diane said I can really identify with much of what you're saying, Connie. Look at that, the second of a second. Okay, so this is great. I want to highlight these three reflections. Barbara said, and ended kind of with the main idea of being able to incorporate all things, all these things, even the things that we would rather not exist. And Debbie talked about that really there's an infinite source of energy that we could tap into, and it's more about not creating that energy but allowing it to flow through us. I would love to be able to tap into the energy all the time with this tiny baby running around. But and Connie, what I heard you saying is that this challenging moment, one of the challenging things right now of the pandemic, the challenge of the pandemic, the suffering, the isolation of it, has brought you to a place of kind of, what I heard you kind of describing it as is like a really centered kind of non-attachment to things that used to elicit a deeper, quicker response in relationship that now don't as much anymore. It may be a softening, you know. I love that. These are all things, as we transition into the book, that were kind of are my hopes in talking about addiction. And this, so the book is actually it's a quick read. You can read it in like a week, a few days. Each chapter begins with a little bit of storytelling of my own story and journey of addiction. So this began with my own recognition of addiction in my own life and the suffering of that addiction, but also the disconnect that I felt in engaging with my addiction and the theology of the church that I had learned and was encountering. So I identify myself as a pornography addict, and still do, and will for a long time. I think that what I learned about addiction through writing the book and then reflecting on it and having conversations since the book came out is that we get really tied up in a lot of definitions of addiction that I think are helpful as a starting point. But what my hope is to take a theological perspective on addiction that goes beyond what are perfectly reasonable definitions of addiction from a psychological standpoint or from a physiological standpoint, thinking about chemical dependence and things like that. When I'm talking about addiction, I'm talking about something that is more general, more kind of universally human, which to me is the experience of this kind of compulsive, ongoing capability that we all have of doing the very thing that we don't want to do, that causes suffering for ourselves and other people. And Paul talked about this very specifically when he said that he does the very thing he does not want to do. And I called that an addiction. And so we can talk about all these different levels of addiction, like opioids or other chemicals that cause a dependence in the system. I appreciate the realities of chemical dependence, but I'm interested in what is underneath that spiritually, for those specific addictions, but also for all of us. And I think that my experience was that addiction taught me something about Christianity that Christianity never taught me in church, that church never taught me about Christianity. So the starting point for all of this was a number of things that kind of happened mostly in my mid-20s. While I was at seminary, I got divorced when I was in seminary. At the end of my second year, my wife and I separated, and I took a year off of school, and I was really reckoning with a lot of things personally, but it was really a moment in my life when everything had kind of fallen away. All of my kind of personal understanding of my own reputation and persona, who I thought I was, my striving to be, to uphold a kind of self-image for the world. What I experienced was that in getting divorced and in doing a lot of things that for so long, in getting divorced and in reckoning with my own addiction and with pornography and things like this, I found that it wasn't so much that I had thought for so long that the whole point of morality or Christianity was to just not do these certain list of things, and that is how you stay healthy and become whole. And what I found actually was that in doing those things and in them totally destroying my life, I became whole through them and not in spite of them. So this was a disconnect for me with the theology that I had encountered. But I was encountering something in 12-step spirituality that I was really appreciating and learning from and healing from. And I thought, if Jesus, if we are made in the image, if I am made in the image of God, and Jesus is about personal transformation and salvation and healing, then there must be the tools in Christianity for this very thing that I'm actually learning outside of Christianity. So this was the gap for me in thinking about addiction, because I didn't hear a lot of theology or Christian talk about addiction that was coming not so much from a place of universal inclusion in this human experience, but really was adopting the language of disease for addiction. So this whole thing really began with my own feeling of pushback and kind of critique of the disease model of addiction. So I would consider this a work of practical theology, in that it incorporated, I bring myself to it, it incorporates, and that the starting point is a disconnect between my personal experience and the theology that I was learning and the practice of that theology in my life. So the general themes of the book, the thesis of the book is that addictions are not indicative of a disconnection from God. An addiction is not indicative of a deviation from my humanity or from God's hope for my life, but addiction is actually indicative of my inherent connection to the divine, and that the actions of my addiction, the physical manifestations of my addiction, those actions that cause me suffering or cause other people suffering, are actually my attempts at reconnecting with the eternal, with God, with the transcendent, and that I go about doing them in ways that end up hurting me. But the source of them is God, is the divine. And so the arc of the book then is about reimagining what we mean when we talk about addiction. And then as Christians, as a tradition who is interested in human suffering, in human anthropology, in theological anthropology, and how we understand humanity, and how we understand our connection to the divine, and how we understand a lifelong journey of what Jesus describes as taking up our crosses. As a tradition who understands the power of death and resurrection from death, what can we learn from this experience of addiction, especially of kind of the spirituality of addiction of the 12 steps? And then how can we take on, let that reality into our theology and let it change our theology so that we can have a better way of responding to human suffering and to addiction. So instead of, not that there's anything wrong with, like the prayers in the prayer book about addiction or anything, but it's like, instead of praying for those addicts over there, what if we could pray for our corporate desire for healing through the actions of suffering that we bring onto ourselves and to other people? How can, in this larger way, we understand all of us as addicted and invited to a transformation through recognition and engagement with that suffering? Because we are all connected to the divine. So then all of our actions that come from this connection are an invitation to follow that thing back to their source and reconnect us to God. So someone just put something in the chat here about you. Was it can you put the name of your book in the post? Yeah, I will put it in the chat. I'll put the name of the book in the chat and a link to the Amazon page if you're interested in getting it. The idea then is that if we engage with this suffering, rather than, like Barbara said so nicely, rather than treat addiction like a thing we need to get rid of, if we engage with it as a teacher, if we engage with it as something beckoning us back to our connection with God that we have in some way lost sight of, if we can engage with it instead of pushing it away, then we can begin the actual process of integrating all these parts of ourselves. And to me, that is what we mean by wholeness. So if we are going to heal, if we're going to become whole, it's not that there's something out there that we have to go get to make ourselves whole. It's that we are already whole, but we are disintegrated. We have broken our wholeness up into a bunch of pieces. Some of them we shove into the dark. In Jungian language, that's what we call our shadow side. Some of them we proudly shine a light on because we're happy about them. They help us culturally to succeed. But the ones that we've pushed away are the ones that are arising and eliciting painful responses from us. And not that we have to cut them away and get rid of them, but that we need to re-engage with them. We have to become whole again. And that the journey that Jesus embodies for us is this journey of becoming whole. It's a journey of becoming whole. So one of the important dialogue partners I have in the book, and that I really began to engage as I was writing the book, is Catherine Keller, who was a process theologian and a professor at Drew University in New Jersey. I'm not going to go into a whole big thing about process theology, but it was a really helpful conversation partner in imagining this idea because process theology is so much about the kind of nowness of God. That it's not that God has a plan that we're all following, but that God is unfolding as we are unfolding, that all of creation is unfolding together, right? And another important part of process theology is that as this is all unfolding, God does not coerce us or creation into any kind of action, but there is an initial aim, an initial desire that God has for creation, for our lives. And that that addiction is our responding to that initial desire and doing it in a way that causes suffering, but that it is still, again, connected to that initial desire, to God. But that this whole thing is unfolding. So as we do things, God is responding. It's not that I do something and God punishes me for doing it. It's that I act, I suffer, God dwells with me in my suffering. And through that dwelling, something new is born. And if I can engage with that thing, then I grow and transform. But as long as I call an addiction a disease, and a disease is something I need to get rid of, then I inherently push that thing away and put it in the box of bad things. And if I don't engage with it, then I never accept the invitation that God is sending me through every addictive behavior and act to reconnect with the divine. So process theology was extremely helpful in kind of reimagining what this would look like theologically. And then Catherine Keller specifically, because she wrote this whole book, which is pretty theological, it's pretty dense, but it's really good. It's called Face of the Deep, where she built this whole theology just from the first verses of Genesis 1, specifically around the idea of God hovering over the deep, the Tehom. And so she creates this Tehomic theology, where from her process perspective, the deep is not some sort of terrible chaos thing that God has to forcibly mold into creation. The deep is the place from which possibilities manifest themselves. It is this endless, infinite pool of potential, of possible things that could happen, right? And now from this thing, all kinds of possibilities manifest themselves. Beautiful and tragic, happy and sad, challenging and joyful, glorious and suffering. That it does not decide, but it elicits the possible. And that as part of creation, we are connected to this deep, this depth, this infinite potential, this depth within us, which is also the depth of God. So this connection that we have to God is through this depth, this deep thing. And that from this depth emerge all these possibilities, right? And if we can engage with this depth, if we can return to it, then we hover with God over the face of it, and we engage gently with it and allow the possibilities to emerge, instead of, from my experience in addiction, trying to manhandle the possibilities and make them what I want them to be. I have this desire for something that comes up from the deep, and I grab it and try to make it what I want it to be, instead of kind of holding it gently. So this all kind of emerges if we think of then addiction as kind of the actions that cause suffering for ourselves or for other people. We have a word in theology for that very thing, actually. And can anybody guess what it is? I bet you guessed sin, and you'd be right. It's sin. And sin, in its original Greek definition, is hamartano. It means to miss the mark. It's like an archery term. So you have your target over here, and you pull back your arrow, and it misses. We focus a lot in kind of conversations about sin and salvation, soteriology, maybe our theology of the cross, of course, about the miss. But I'm more interested in the fact that there is a target and that we are aiming at it, right? So that when I sin, when I cause suffering, how can I engage with the reality that I'm aiming at the target and not that I missed it? Not to hate myself for missing it, but to be with myself in my aim, in that initial aim that is God's aim for me and for creation. So the idea is to kind of build then a natural theology of sin from this idea of addiction. That a sin is not just this thing on a list of things God doesn't like me to do, though maybe God desires me to not do them because God knows that they will cause me suffering. But I actually am responsible for discerning what is sin and what is not, based on what is causing me suffering or causing other people suffering. So that sin is then based on an experience, my experience of life as a human being. And I am invited to recognize that thing which is causing me suffering, that thing which is my sin. And so sin is not necessarily, you might think, well, if we take this list away, then how we know what a sin is? And then you say, well, it's individual to the person. Well, then you say, well, then it's relative. And we don't really like relativism. But what I would suggest is that it's not so much relative as it is relational. that what's most important about sin is our capacity to be in relationship with ourselves, to understand it, and then with other people to share it and to understand what other people are suffering with. So then what we recognize is that this addiction is actually in many ways, to recognize our addiction is a great gift. Because if Jesus is inviting us to take up our cross and to follow him, to take up the thing that is going to cause us to die in many ways, then if we can identify what our addiction is, we know the thing that we need to take up, which is in the end a wonderful thing. It's painful and it's terrible, but so is the cross. But if we can take it up and follow Jesus and carry it and be crucified on it, then we have the possibility of God working through that death to heal, to resurrect us. And so I focus on a few stories from Scripture. One of them is actually the Hebrew Scripture reading for today. It is Jacob wrestling with God, and I love this story because to me I love the idea that Jacob is in the darkest place in his life, in the night. He doesn't know what is going to happen. He's fearful of his brother Esau. And in this deep darkness, he wrestles with what he believes is an enemy, something he wants to get rid of, a thing that he thinks is there just to hurt him. And as the light begins to shine on this adversary, he realizes that it is not an enemy, but it has been God all along, with which he has been wrestling. And this is my hope for this reimagining of addiction, that we for so long I thought this was the thing that was the worst part of me, that I needed to get rid of. In reality, what I was wrestling with was God. What I was wrestling with was an invitation from the divine to carry on my journey with a new name, like being transformed in the morning, because Jacob doesn't walk away from that encounter scot-free. He has a limp, he's never the same again, but he carries this mark of struggling with him and carries it into the rest of his life. And the other thing I like to highlight in the book is that we talk a lot in our soteriology and our theology of salvation about John 3:16, and I am interested in looking a little bit earlier than that in John 3:14 and 15, because Jesus says, yes, in 3:16, God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son. But in 3:14, he says, like Moses lifted up the bronze serpent on the cross, so will the Son of Man be lifted up. And he's talking about a story from Numbers where the Israelites are all complaining and God sends snakes to bite them, and everyone that gets bitten starts to die. And Moses is like, God, help us. And God says, well, if you fashion a snake out of bronze and you hold it up, whoever looks on the snake will be healed. This is such an interesting story for Jesus to bring up right before he talks about salvation and the cross, his cross, because it seems like he's not so much saying, I'm going to do this thing so you don't have to. He's saying, just like in the desert, God didn't take away the source of suffering, but made the very source of suffering, when lifted up, the source of healing. So if we are to take up our cross, then that engagement with addiction is the very doorway through which we walk to healing and transformation. So that if we are able to be honest about our addiction, about our suffering, if we can engage with it, and especially if we can engage with it in community and lift it up in the community of the Israelites, in the community of our congregations, then that very act of lifting up, about being honest and vulnerable, is itself a healing experience. And I want to make sure we get to questions. So I think I'll stop there. There's a lot more that I could talk about, but Does anybody have any thoughts or questions or comments about those general themes? And while
Yes.
you ask, I'm going to also put this in the...
I thought that was very profound. This idea that our suffering can, or addictions in this case, be grist for the mill. If I can be a devil's advocate for a minute, I remember in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, there's a story of the man who's got the lizard on his shoulder. And the lizard is the bad guy telling him he's worthless. And his friend, who is in heaven and trying to get him there, keeps saying, I've got to kill that lizard or you won't, this is going to kill you. And but the man says, oh, I can live with it. I can, deal with it. I've become, we've gotten to be sort of work together. So no, don't. And his friend keeps saying, I got to kill him or he's going to kill you. So finally the man says, okay. And the friend in heaven kills the lizard on his shoulder. And the man becomes a beautiful winged creature and goes to heaven. So it's the idea to get rid of them rather than engage with them. So I wonder how that theology fits with yours.
Barbara, can I jump in here for a moment? Because I'm sorry, Barbara, you actually don't remember the story quite right. What happens is a lizard is transformed into a horse, and the man rides the horse and then goes on to heaven. So it fits in exactly what David is saying, is that the lizard which was hurting him, he transforms and cooperates with, and it becomes a fulfillment rather than something that's pulling him down.
Oh, I guess I had the different interpretation.
Yeah, that's how, that's my remembrance of that particular episode in The Great Divorce, in fact, is exactly in line with what David is talking about. Sorry, I don't mean to contradict you, but I'm just
saying. The man becomes, all right, that's how I remember it differently.
So what I hear you saying is that I'm right.
It's not a matter of who's right, who's wrong.
At least maybe C.S. Lewis and I are in agreement on that. Yeah, I don't know that story, but I would agree with C.S. Lewis based on Calvin's recollection. Yeah.
For me, I think it just, what you described is how we practice the Eucharist every week. This is the process of what we celebrate in our Eucharist. It's the taking, it's the breaking, it's the blessing, and it's the giving. And that's what I hear in my experience. I'm an addict in recovery, and for me, it has been transformative. I wouldn't have found God and this relationship with God had I not been addicted. For some reason, I was really image conscious. I grew up in a family where image was everything. And so I couldn't be honest with myself. And it wasn't through any other thing than addiction that I was able to get real enough to find my way and to have this transformation. I really love what you're saying. I identify with it, and I'm very grateful for being able to participate today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and this is my hope. My hope was by taking addiction and recognizing its theological counterpart, sin, if we're all about gathering and recognizing our sinfulness in the way that we think, in the way that we recognize sin as missing the mark and an invitation to re-engaging with our depth, then we're on the pathway to, then we can recognize how what we're doing all the time is working for this lifelong journey of transformation through this kind of death and resurrection. So it's not just the addicts who are in recovery and the 12 steps that get to be transformed from their suffering. It's all of us that get to be transformed through our suffering, and that Jesus was embodying that very reality and teaching about that very reality as well, about interior transformation. Of course, now I would also say that he was accompanying that with a clear commandment to take part in world and cultural and societal transformation, but you cannot disconnect those two things. That the more we are able to engage with our suffering and take on our own work of transformation, that should be pushing us towards greater work of justice and transformation in the world. And if one is happening, and if we're doing a work of interior transformation and it's not pushing us out into the world, then I would question the efficacy of that interior transformation. If it's actually transformation, or if it's just a fun ego project that we're thinking about. Any other thoughts or questions?
During this lockdown, this is Sue Kelly. I've been listening to a lot of Richard Rohr recently, and he is talking not particularly about addiction, but about first and second half of life things. But he talks about how when we're young, we have to use the strengths that we're given, the gifts that we're given, and we have other gifts that we reject. And those, when we get into our 30s, usually, they become a stumbling block to us in a sense, and we have to reincorporate those gifts that we're not proud of. And I think that often comes through some sort of confrontation with our darker selves, as a Jungian would say, the shadow side. But through addiction, or we just find our life isn't working the way it should. And for me, that was a point in my life where I found that the Adult Children of Alcoholics was very helpful for me, and helped me see, and actually using religious language, how I was succumbing to what we'd been taught as the 7 deadly sins, but there was a very definite pattern for me of pride going through things. So I was able to use that to look at some of my darker side. And I'm not sure that this is different, but I think there are different ways of looking at the same thing. And I think that it is a gift, and perhaps it's a stronger gift to those who are addicted to be able to look at it and confront it more definitively than those who don't have an outwardly observable addiction. And I'm interested in this process. Theology is an extremely interesting concept. Okay, so that's my comment.
Thanks, Sue. Yes, process theology is very interesting. I agree. And that was what you just said is kind of the idea of the title of the book. Actually, the title of the book is also the title of a song and album by Switchfoot from 2005, who I love. But the beautiful letdown is this idea that this addiction was the thing that I thought was going to make everything better. Like, it was, so many of these things were what I thought my life was about, and they all let me down. And it really was a beautiful and terrible letdown when it happened, you know. Yeah, so thanks Sue.
How does it fit with Jesus' attitude if, you know, your hand causes you to sin, cut off your hand? You know, or the idea of, you know, knock out your sins early before they become bigger.
Yeah, I always struggle with that from Jesus, because I don't really want to cut things off. That's kind of the opposite of the thesis of the book.
Disease.
Yeah. So I don't know what to do with Jesus on that one. I don't know what to do with Jesus a lot of the time. Yeah.
David, have you found that I don't know what to call it, the secular word might be resiliency approach. I don't know if that's appropriate, but does this this approach align with any, let's call them secular clinical practices in treating addiction and helping addiction? Is this, do you know what I'm asking? Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you're seeking supportive treatment for addiction and recovery and moving away from the disease sort of mindset, have you found any practical tips on how to find support that helps you realign that, you know, as you were sort of let down in your own journey, and seeing this as sort of a way to re-aim for the target as opposed to just force yourself into changing your behavior?
Mm-hmm. The only kind of recovery program that I've ever engaged with is the 12 steps. And I don't know, I mean, there are definitely trained psychologists here that could probably answer the question of intervention options better than me. And what I would say, this might not be a direct answer to your question, but what I would say is that what I don't want to do is say that everybody should stop doing all of those interventions that are working and just go to church. That's definitely not my point. My point is that I think that's a couple things. Whatever creates because what is necessary is the space to begin to wonder about the addiction itself and the behavior, right? So whatever the process is going to be, whatever intervention is required to create the space to be able to begin to ask these questions is important, whatever that might be. Whether that is a residential treatment center, whether it's a 12-step program. For many people, that's what rock bottom is just hitting that place where it's just not working. And I begin to ask myself, what else is there? Maybe it is, it could be any kind of intervention. You know, if it's a chemical intervention to help kind of interrupt the chemical dependence on a drug like opioids or anything like that. This to me is about our role as the church of accompanying people and inviting people on a spiritual journey that does not take over the importance of the physical or psychological interruption of the pattern of addiction or harmful self-behavior or suffering self-behavior. But that we are called to complement that so that we can realize the full invitation of these suffering behaviors of addiction. So that because Bill Wilson was very clear that he got to a place, Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, got to a very clear understanding later in his life, many years into his sobriety, that the goal of recovery isn't just not doing a behavior. The goal of recovery is what he called emotional sobriety, but what we might call healing or transformation or salvation, wholeness. That's what I'm saying, is that as much as it's important to stop the behavior, the behavior is indicative of a deeper journey that we're being called to engage with. And so I think that what I'm suggesting is that we take our place as a journey partner alongside these other intervention models, and that we, as much as we can, destigmatize talking about suffering and sin, so that if we're really doing what Jesus was doing, which was sitting with people who the Bible describes as sinners, if we were actually in community recognizing our own pain and suffering and sin, and being open and compassionate and wondering about that of the world and of the people around us, then we wouldn't have people like me who went through so much of life having a deep shame about engaging in a behavior that I was taught was just a bad thing that you shouldn't do, and therefore couldn't talk about it. What if we could really talk about the things that are causing us suffering? You know, what if that was one of our main goals as a community, as a Christian community, following Jesus's example of sitting and having and eating meals with people who are in pain and suffering. And I think that there's a lot of ways to do that. I think that small groups are a great way to do that, but the small groups only work if we create that space intentionally, you know? And all of the things that we do in community, like sacramental, like liturgy and sacraments, those are all things that can aid us on our journey, similar to what Dean said before about the Eucharist. But if we think about the Eucharist as like Augustine said, you are what you eat. We consume the death and resurrection because we are living out death and resurrection. If we think about baptism as an invitation to the depth within us, an invitation to engage with the deep, then it's not just a ritual to get your membership card to Christianity. It's actually an invitation to a lifelong journey of engaging with the depth, with that chaos that is inside us. So we have all these amazing tools to create the space and invite people on that journey of recovery rather than just abstinence. And those two things are different things to me.
One way to, I think, put them together is that you engage the target early. I mean, biologically, dopamine seems to be the basis for addiction. I mean, it may be a form of, spiritual transcendence, but if you don't nip it in the bud, it will go on and extend to the norepinephrine system, the serotonin system. So like to treat it in its early stages is best, but for an alcohol, you've got to get people out of the context that triggers their cues, which only exacerbates the system. So I think your idea of engaging the target early is certainly the right one, but it may be having to also divorce yourself from the other influences that are exacerbating the condition, both biologically and psychologically and spiritually.
And I would also say that just because I identified an addiction to pornography doesn't mean I stopped having addictions or things that I would call addictions, right? So that as much as we might identify those specific substance kind of things, we're going to spend our whole lives, if we are serious about doing this thing where we go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the depths of ourselves, we are going to continue to engage with and find new challenges at each level of depth. So the principles that we take from the first level will transfer to the second level, but there will be new challenges to those and those and those, and keep going on. This is something that Richard Rohr talks about too. But what we're talking about is a lifelong process and journey of wholeness making and recovery and healing and transformation. And as much as those specific individual things I agree with are, as much suffering as we can, as little suffering as there needs to be, we should have that little suffering. I agree. But suffering is just part of who we are. We're always going to be suffering at some level for something. That's just part of being a human being. So if we can build up our resilience, our perseverance for engaging with suffering, if we can recognize its power and how important it is for our transformation, rather than it being a thing that we need to avoid at all costs, then we'll be able to engage for our whole lives in all of these different ways, instead of just needing to end behaviors over and over and over again. It's more about, what is this behavior inviting me to? And that brings me back to the opening guided meditation. It is to say, what was that impulsive, painful thing that you did this past week? Whatever that thing was, that's your cross to take up today. How can you lift that thing up? You know, how can you engage that thing? Because the thing to me is that if we identify that as just a problem, as just like an evil thing, as a diseased part of ourselves, we're never going to learn from it. That part of ourselves is part of us. That is that's one of the pieces that makes up the image of God in us. How could that thing be evil? How could that thing be a disease? That is trying to bring us to our wholeness, to our transformation. So instead of hating that thing we did, as much as it was painful, can we create this sense of wonder and compassion for ourselves, of desire and curiosity to learn from those things that are coming up from within us? And that, I think, that is to me what Jesus is modeling. And we can walk that journey in community. And we have all these amazing sacraments and rituals and things to help us mark those parts of our journey and to put them into the context and the container of our transformation and our healing and salvation.
Thank you, David. What a wonderful gift to have David with us again here at St. Paul's Great Hall. Oops, oh, is that right? In the St. Paul's Forum this morning. How beautiful and articulate and wonderful a vision he paints for us of allowing us this non-dual way of journeying inside to find God's vision and hope for each of us. I hope that we have David back again soon and that we'll see more of him in the future. Zoom allows us to do that because I believe he's also worshiping with his home church today, but Zoom allows him to travel very quickly to another place.
Yes, right now, actually.
So with that, thank you again, David, and we'll see you all in church very shortly.
Thanks, everybody. It was good to see your faces.
Thank you, David.
Thank you all.